Nestled in among the mid-century neighborhood of Yeso Street, in an unassuming little yellow house. You'd barely even notice it set back in its rock nook, between two other homes as you drove past, and even if you did, you'd hardly give it a second glance. It's unfathomable to think such a quaint little house could hold a dark and terrifying secret, but for Eddie and his family, that quiet little dream became a place of nightmares. Growing up in California, Eddie didn't see much of the otherworldly, except maybe one time that he says he didn't think much of. The paranormal was an everyday topic of conversation around his family, but he didn't really believe and didn't want to. I had a lady who sees spirits tell me once that I have the ability if I just try. But I don't want to see them, he said. Eddie moved to New Mexico in 1999, and it was then the more paranormal things began intruding in his life. He'd see things here or there, hear sounds at night, or feel something off when he was visiting a friend's home. Still, he pushed through those experiences aside and focused on life. He met his wife Diana, started a family, and in 2005 moved into that cozy little yellow house on Yeso. A few years later, their fourth child, Alyssa, was born. The day the couple crossed the threshold, it was as if they crossed over into the world beyond. From the day we moved in, we would always hear a ball bouncing in the attic. At night, he could hear it rolling her up there. I told my wife it was probably squirrels. We had a lot of problems with squirrels back then. Eddie knew it wasn't squirrels, but he didn't want to admit it was something otherworldly, especially if it meant upsetting his wife so soon after giving birth to their daughter. So Eddie tried to ignore the strange happening in his home and focused on supporting his family. But the thing in his homes weren't to be ignored. That ball was always bouncing in the attic. Just a few weeks after moving in, Eddie experienced something terrifying that set the tone for the next 8 years that he lived in that house. He found himself awakened from a dead sleep, and as his eyes popped open, he got the immediate sense something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. As his eyes scanned the darkened room, the only sound was the whirling of the oscillating fan on the dresser across the room. Suddenly, the door swings open, and I see this big, black shadow standing in the doorway. Eddie said it looked like someone real tall with a trench coat, wearing one of those round scarecrow kind of hats. As soon as I see that, I try to wake my wife, but I can't scream or move. I'm trying as hard as I can to scream, but all I can hear is myself grunting. The figure in the door stepped into the room and slowly circled the bed as Eddie says he fought with all his might to move or scream. It picks up the fan and throws it at the bed, he said. As soon as he threw the fan, I could move, and I screamed and woke my wife up just as the fan lands on the bed. Eddie jumped from the bed and went to the light switch. Where he turned, the figure was gone. Trying to explain away the happening, his wife suggested the fan just fell off the dresser. But Eddie said the dresser was nearly 6 feet from the bed. Sleep for Eddie didn't come the rest of the night, especially when the ball started rolling around in the attic. Within days of the experience, more unusual things began happening in the home. On a most daily basis, the couple would see shadows darting through the home, or they wake up to find the drawers and cabinets in the kitchen standing open, and then there was that almost nightly racket from the attic crawlspace. That damned ball. Then one weekend, not long after Alyssa was born, Eddie's wife and children went to visit family. leaving Eddie alone in the home. I was in bed asleep, and I woke up to the sound of a baby crying, he said. I was still half asleep and rolled over to wake up my wife, and she wasn't there. I thought, oh, she's up making a bottle for the baby. So I got up to go pick up the baby. As soon as I opened the door to the kids' room, the crying stopped, and then it hit me. I'm home alone. Eddie didn't even look into the room. He closed the door and tiptoed back into his bed, pulling the covers over his head. The ball in the attic suddenly rolling overhead. I didn't want to see what it was, he said. What began happening next should have sent the couple running from the home in terror. But even with so much going on, they couldn't afford to just up and move, and it ultimately became easier to ignore and even hide it from each other than accept that their home was haunted. Alyssa was a sweet newborn, but one day Eddie picked up his daughter to hold her, and when he looked into the face of his precious baby, what he saw looking back at him terrified him. She would look at me and growl while I was holding her. He said, it was not the kind of a look a baby gives in the growl. It scared the hell out of me. Eddie didn't tell his wife for fear of upsetting her until many years later, and that's when she admitted she'd seen the same thing on multiple occasions. Their daughter was being possessed. Eddie hoped leaving the house behind would mean an end to the paranormal activities, but perhaps it wasn't the home that the problem was, because as Alyssa grew older, she began having conversations with imaginary friends and acting strangely even after the family moved from the home. She always had imaginary friends, and she would get mad if she would sit down where she said her friend was sitting, Eddie said. Eddie still drives by the home now and again, and he said he wonders if the new owners have the same experiences. One room always gives me the creeps. I always thought something must have gone on there, or something was buried there. You never know what could be there. The new owner of the home has lived there 3 years and said he hasn't seen or heard anything in all that time. Perhaps because the activity has continued even as the family moved to their new home. Perhaps following Alyssa, as Eddie fears. Maybe it was Eddie and his family that stirred up the activity in the home. Or maybe it was just waiting for the right tenant to move in. But Eddie knows one thing. He didn't imagine it. Eddie's family moved out of the home in 2012. But just before moving out, a roof leak forced Eddie to hire contractors to open up the crawl space in the attic to make repairs. Curiosity got the better of Eddie, and he couldn't resist exploring the noisy crawl space, and for that, so many years had troubled his sleep. Through the cobwebs and dust, Eddie explored the crawl space, something in a far corner catching his eye in the gleam of the flashlight. Boxes. Empty boxes of porcelain dolls made in the 1960s, except one box wasn't empty. It still had a doll inside. His wife begged him to leave them alone for fear of removing them would cause whatever haunted the home to follow them. So Eddie put the boxes back and he made his way back down from the attic. Suddenly, his eyes caught a glimpse of something he'd missed on his way in, and his blood ran cold. There in the little nook in the back of the attic sat a ball. A blue ball, its color showing clearly in the beam of the flashlight, the decades of dust that should have coated it knocked clean.